I'm delighted to introduce to you this evening Dr. Robin Boré. And she is originally from Canada, but she's coming to us from the University of St. Andrews, where she is the associate lecturer in Christian ethics. And her research focuses on child ethics, as well as medical and environmental ethics. I really appreciate how Robin is committed to recognizing the gifts and abilities that children bring and how we can learn from them and how they might shape us and inform us. I actually first met Robin from a COVID-safe distance at the front steps of her home just after she and her family moved to St. Andrews from Canada. Almost a year and a half ago now, just as Scotland was coming out of the first lockdown. But it was actually through my husband, who is a colleague of hers at the university, that I learned more about her very thoughtful work on children's spirituality within the context of Christian ethics. And when considering a keynote speaker for this conference, Robin's name immediately came to mind. And I know that you will all get a lot from what Robin has to share with us this evening. There will be plenty of time for some Q&A at the end of Robin's talk. If you could just hold your questions until the end, and hopefully you have found the chat function, and we'd ask that you just type your questions into the chat box, and then we'll make sure that she has time to address all of those in due course. So without further ado, Robin, I turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm just going to warn you now, there are two places in my talk where I'll stop and just encourage you guys to shout out the first thing that comes to your mind. If you want to wonder about it, you're welcome to. So when I do ask that, feel free to just unmute and say whatever it is that pops into your mind, or if you feel more comfortable putting it in the chat, that's also okay. So yeah, just be warned that I'm going to call on you, which is always necessary, especially in an online conference when you stare at the screen for a while and it just starts to mesmerize. I won't have any slides today, and nor do I have any little wooden people. So I'm sorry about that. I don't even have a dog, though there's one in the painting behind me. And I guess we can ask whether that gets to be a dog of godly play or not. It's wonderful to be with you all this evening. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's really special to be gathered with all of you who are at this conference to think deeply and passionately about the spiritual lives of children. For someone like me who thinks a lot about children in my work, primarily in theology and especially in ethics, it's a real treat to be here with you talking about our shared interest. Today's talk is called Becoming the Children of God, Mutuality and Asymmetry in Relationship. And what this means will, I hope, become clear over the next 45 minutes or so. I'll try to keep a lid on my own enthusiasm to leave plenty of room for your questions and for discussion, because I want to make sure to leave time for your response as well, and for you to share how some of these thoughts fit with the work that you are doing with children. Tonight's talk is a little bit theoretical. I hope not too much. But of course, for me to stand up here and lecture you about what it's like to be in the circle with children would be so presumptuous. So what I want instead is for me to reflect on some elements of children's spirituality, and for you to really then, in our discussion, have a chance to think about how that intersects with what you do in the circle and what you do over the threshold. In some ways too, what I'm going to talk about tonight is not as much about the nitty-gritty elements of children's spirituality, but something that I think is really important, which is the context in which children are spiritual beings. And what I mean by that is we often think about the spirituality of children, but we sometimes forget to zoom out a little bit and ask, what is the place of children's spirituality in their relationships, in our relationships with them, in our churches, and in our families? I want to say in this talk, I'm mostly going to talk about children and adults, but I don't want you to think that there's somehow two categories of life. In fact, this strict divide, often at age 18, between a child and adult, often perpetuates mistaken ideas about children as capable of or incapable of certain things, and adults as being capable of different things. It can lead us to a romanticize, but also devalue childhood, while treating adults as something categorically different. Adults are those characterized by reason and language, as opposed to fantasy and sensory play or something like that. We should recognize a continuum between a child and adult, a continuum that includes infants and babies and toddlers and tweens and teens and adolescents and young adults and parents and youths and middle-aged people and the elderly and so on. So when I speak about a child in this talk, I'm going to generally mean actually often what Jerome Berryman means, which is kind of toddler to puberty, 2 to 12 years old or so. But I want you to understand that I'm using child and adult just as a shorthand, because I can't say infant, baby, toddler, tween, teenager, young adult, parent, youth, elderly every single time. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about asymmetry and mutuality and what those mean. And then I'm going to relate them to some specifically theological claims about children and about what it means to be a child of God. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways we can learn from children by paying attention to their spirituality. I especially want to encourage all of us to think about children and adults together as disciples of Christ, to think about formation as a shared endeavor where everyone contributes particular gifts and teachings. And in saying this, I want to challenge the idea that children have some pure spiritual relationship with God that only needs language to be expressed. I think this type of sentimentalizing can be dangerous, and historically it's led to the segregation of children in churches as pre-human or pre-moral or pre-thoughtful. This is not, of course, to say that children are not already in relationship with God, because they most certainly are. But their spirituality and their relationality needs to be nurtured and formed as well. I also want to challenge the idea that adulthood is the goal of the spiritual life, and that formation is a one-way street where adults form children. Instead, I want to invite us to think about the ways in which children form adults, where the gifts of childhood help adults to better understand our ultimate goal, which is to be the children of God. And as an aside, I just want to say that I saw one of your conference sessions is on intergenerational godly play, where I imagine you're doing exactly this kind of thing. So adults and children share a mutual and asymmetrical relationship. This claim I owe to a man whose name is Brock Baller, who in turn uses this language to illustrate what he sees in the thinking of Levinas and Merleau-Ponty. And there's no quiz here, so don't worry about the names, but I say them so that many of you may have encountered these names, and you might want to situate them in your own thinking. So what does this mean to claim that children and adults share an asymmetrical and mutual relationship? Well, it's to say something about what it means to be human, by considering where and how life begins. It's a reaction to the idea that we start out lives as bubble people, as selves, as these perfectly formed individuals. You know, there's me and there's you. We might kind of bump up against each other, but we don't have a ton to do with each other. Baller is paying attention to the claims made by philosophers about what they call our intersubjectivity. The fact that we don't start out as I and thou, but we start out more deeply enmeshed in relationships. And those relationships form our selfhood. So before I even knew myself to be an I, before I knew myself to be myself, before I could call myself Robin, I'm already constituted by others. And even my very body is received from others, right? So is the language by which I will start to ask questions, the culture by which I know what the world is, and even the very world in which I am a part. I am formed by others before I even know what a self or an other is. So the claim I am making is that the child from the womb, from infancy, is born into the world into a set of traditions and rituals and obligations and spiritualities that precede their ability to recognize or question. And this mutuality isn't a diminishment of each person. We're not the Borg. Resistance isn't futile. But love, actually, when we think of the love between people, it's not ruined by this, but it's strengthened by mutuality. Love is what enables the child to experience their absolute neediness as something, as a gift, and not as a threat. And here, what we could call a radical givenness. We start to see glimpses of asymmetry. The child primarily receives, but that's only part of the story. And it's the one we tend to focus on. But the very presence of children changes their parents as well as the wider communities. Children, by their very existence, as well as by their questions and their actions, they invite their parents to creatively reevaluate that which they will pass down. And children open up a world of subjectivity that we sometimes have forgotten about. That is, they actually tell us something about our humanity. And this happens even before a child is born. Even before the face-to-face encounter, there's an enfleshed, we could say enwombed encounter between a mother and a gestating child that invites the mother to reevaluate her view of herself and her place in the world. And when we fall in love, as parents do when they meet their first child, and grandparents and friends and cousins and siblings, we find new values and new judgments and new ways of being in relationship. Think about the change that's brought about when someone's expecting a child. That child in the womb is already changing her parents and her siblings and her surroundings. We sometimes mistakenly think of this as just a subjective change, maybe on the part of the pregnant woman or on the parents, and not as a communication. And to be sure, there are ways in which this is a heavily mediated communication, right? One person, often the parents here are kind of doing the heavy lifting. Or maybe it feels wrong to call it communication because we're accustomed to think of communication in very verbal ways. But communication happens in so many ways. Intersubjectively, it happens through our bodies, it happens through touch and presence. Think about the way the child changes its parents in utero. It brings new meaning to certain words like mother and father. A woman suddenly tries on new conceptions of herself as a mother. This in turn deepens her ideas of self and of motherhood. She might reconsider or really reevaluate her own relationship to her mother, or maybe to the motherhood of Mary in the scriptures. A child changes the relationship between a couple, sometimes in complicating ways, as a couple struggles to reconcile the idea of their partner being this erotic sexual being and also a parent. This is true of friends and family who have to consider themselves as aunts or uncles or grandparents. Friends consider what it means to be friends with someone who's a parent instead of friends with that wild child they met on a school bus trip. Hans Urs von Balthasar puts it this way. He says, even in the womb, the child is already other. It's constituted by relationships, but already an other, already someone who communicates. And after birth, this communication continues through pre-linguistic and sometimes even characterized as precognitive, the infant assumes a latent meaning in the actions of others. It's capable of the same intentions as its parents. It responds by imitating their gestures and their facial features and all the rest. I always think of this when I think of the studies showing the impact of skin-on-skin relationship between adults and infants. And what's really interesting there is that the skin on skin relationship, something completely nonverbal, actually predisposes children to better linguistic development. And that's true even if the parent doesn't say anything to the child whose skin is touching theirs. By claiming that even the child in the womb is communicating and these infants are communicating and changing us, we see the important truth that there's something deeper than language that connects us, something out of which language, out of which selfhood, out of which spirituality, out of which communication arises. So I talked a little bit about the way an infant in the womb communicates, but this is your first chance to throw out some things. I want to hear, when you think of young children, when you're in the Godly Play classroom with these toddlers and the children, what are the ways you notice that they really communicate verbally or non-verbally? It's hard when we're not in a room and I can't just point to people. Any thoughts?
I've noticed how much they want to touch things. I mean, sometimes it's things like the Holy Family, and sometimes it's just the pieces of whatever story, but you know, they really do want to touch and play with the objects, to hold them. So yeah, rather than verbally communicating through touch.
That's great. Yeah. Are there other ways that you guys really notice the children in your rooms wanting to communicate with you?
In the Whova chat, we have eye contact and gesture and pointing.
Yeah, those are great. Yeah. Yeah, eye contact's powerful, isn't it? And sometimes, you just think, oh, why is this kid looking at me? Not, oh, this is a communication. I mean, sometimes they are just staring at you, probably at breakfast with your toddler, but yeah. Anything else?
My daughter's just come back in from Rainbows and handed me a drawing, so she communicates through her artwork.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and so what we see is this communication that happens with the whole self, and that children that they want it, and that they want it, they crave it, but it's very much a part of who they are and how they share in the world with us. And so by paying attention, we learn things about them, but we also learn things about us, and we pay attention, oh, their communication has invited me to think about how communication can happen. The fact that this child needs to touch me all the time makes me think about touch in my other relationships. The fact that I don't get to pee alone anymore, makes me think about what bathrooms are for and why we have bathroom stalls. In these experiences, all of them, children can open us to the surprising element of encounter with others, illuminated especially or maybe first in the parent-child relationship. So Brock Baller says, I believe the parent-child relationship, and perhaps most of our encounters with others, is marked by a structure of similarity despite difference. Excuse me. I have a wee one in nursery, and it's that time of the year, the cough season. So our encounter with others is marked by a structure of similarity despite difference, of the capacity to imitate and reciprocate behavior, and yet to surprise and shock the other. The encounter is marked by a surplus to be completed or satisfied. And that's precisely what gives the relationship this attractive, life-giving, vibrant quality. The relationship between children and adults is illustrated powerfully, but not exclusively, in the parent-child relationship. And this is important, I think, sometimes because we tend in our culture to think of children as primarily in relationship with their parents and only secondarily in relationship with anyone else. And of course, this is somewhat true, but it also obscures the whole network of relationships that are part of a child's life, including, of course, their church families. And for you, these networks will be so obvious because you're working in them every day. The relationship between children and adults then is mutual in that there's communication both ways, but it's also asymmetrical. But this asymmetry, and this is why Brock-Butler chooses the word asymmetry, is it is never a one-way street. It's not an arrow of direction. There's a mutuality, but we can think about like Mr. Potato Head. There's the little part and the big part. And then sometimes what the little thing and the big thing are going to be, they're going to change a little bit, but it's all part of one mutual thing. Consider even the utter dependency of an infant. This is where we might think of the biggest difference between a child and an adult. The child in or out of the womb depends on those around her for her very life. She cannot feed, clean, or care for herself. It's the adults in her life that are responsible for providing all of those things. But even here, there's a mutuality. First, the child in her looks and cries and actions expresses her needs and places a demand on those around her. She displays her individuality through her particular preferences for having one arm out of the swaddle or being nursed to sleep, even from infancy, even from a few days old. Her particular needs and preferences will shape how the parents respond to her dependence. But interestingly, the dependency of an infant is in many ways often accompanied by a renewed experience of dependency on the part of her parents. They suddenly need meals brought. They need someone to help with laundry. They're suddenly calling their mother 3 times a week, asking her how she did cloth nappies and how to swaddle. And they're asking the district nurse, how do you get a good latch? So in the dependency, this utter difference between a child and an adult, you have this resurgence of the same type of experience. Or we could consider language narrowly conceived. An infant in or out of, and by narrowly conceived, I mean words. Of course, language is much more than that, and you know that, of course, in godly play. The infant in and out or out of the womb does not yet speak in words, but already, as I kind of illustrated above, invites parents and the other adults around them to reconsider the meaning of words, like mother, father, or parent, or partner, or laundry, or free time. The pre-linguistic child receives language, to be sure, but already shapes the language of others. So language is not just handed down and taught to children, though of course it's that too, but children share in the formation of our language. It always strikes me when I think of this, that when we tell the story of the Christ child, we almost always start with Christmas, with Jesus being born in a stable. But that's not where the story of the incarnation starts. It's not December 25th, but on March 25th, the Feast of the Annunciation, because in the church calendar, babies come exactly 9 months later. In many Protestant churches, the Feast of the Annunciation is not celebrated. It's categorized as one of those suspicious Marian feasts. But to call the Annunciation a Marian feast is to only see half the story. It's also a Jesus feast. It's the beginning of his earthly life, and a reminder that the start of Jesus's life is inseparable from the Marian story. Mary's not accidentally there. She's not a touch of local color like the oxen and the asses beside the womb. Jesus begins his life, as we all do, inside the body of another. Elizabeth Gandolfo O'Donnell begins her entire theological consideration here with natality. And I think this tendency to forget natality causes a lot of theological problems, including the way we tend to relegate the formation of children as women's work. Now, I want to be clear, I don't think women are any less worthy to be teaching in the church. That women teach children is, to me, a bonus for those children. But it reflects the fact that we often think of this work as secondary in the kingdom of God. Unlike the serious work that's done at the altar and in the pulpit by men, the formation of children can be left in the hands of those with less spiritual authority. And the danger here isn't really so much for women and children, frankly, for whom natality is better remembered. The danger is that the church forgets how it began. The church, the body of Christ, began inside the body of another. How can we understand then what it means to be children of God if children are relegated to the back room and our very human origins are obscured as irrelevant? The consequences of this, O'Donnell writes, is a tendency to prioritize our control, our invulnerability, our self-sufficiency, rather than our dependence and our communality and our relationality. And as I'm going to talk about a bit later, this has an impact on what we do or what we think about when Jesus talks about being the children of God. So why all this talk of natality on a conference on children, and really mostly children from toddlers to pubescence? It may seem a bit abstract from a conversation about children's spirituality. But I talk about it because I want to invite you to consider not only the Christ child and the children you encounter in your homes and on Sunday mornings and in the classroom, but I want to invite you to start considering your own relationship to childhood, to the childhood that persists in all of us. Natality isn't something true only of children or only of women. It's how each and every single person begins their life. Even when the educational element of a parent's authority disappears when children come of age, it doesn't abolish the original relationship of giving and responding personal love between children and parents. It is true even of the incarnate Son of God. It is central and not accidental that when God came down as human, he was born of a woman. It is only by considering natality that we can properly understand how our relationship to children is both asymmetrical but truly mutual from the beginning, from that communication that happens even before children are born. It's from this perspective, I think also, that we can understand children as our brothers and sisters in the faith, those whom we teach, but who also teach us. So this account of human beings, this paying attention to where we began, allows us to posit an asymmetry of relationship between an adult and a child, but also between an adult and an adolescent, or an adolescent and a child, or older and younger children, between toddlers and infants, that's predicated on a common humanity. That means that children aren't totally different from us. We have responsibilities towards them. There are important limitations, vulnerabilities of childhood. And of course, there's a difference of capacity. But these capacities come from a common foundation. It's the same humanity. And so thinking about it this way also allows us to speak of the ways in which the goods of childhood, like creativity, like humility, like responsiveness to others, like curiosity and resilience and aptitude for learning and flexibility, in turn calls adults to see themselves in new ways. But just as important to the mutuality is the asymmetry, because it prevents us from making an error in thinking that there's no important differences between children and adults, right? To say, oh, well, we're just all the same. Recognition of asymmetry in this mutual relationship allows us to see that it's in the diversity of humanity that we find the whole picture of what it means to be humans created in the image of God. And this asymmetry and mutuality is illustrated in all sorts of Bible stories. So we have lots of texts about the responsibility of parents towards children. A key part of the covenant, between God and Israel, is the raising up of children in the faith. But we also have a responsiveness of children through whom God works to complete his plans when adults have failed. We can think of Samuel, right, responding when Eli's sons and Eli, by the story's implication, have failed. So then this idea of children as asymmetrical and mutual in relationship to us helps us identify 3 common errors that are really common in our culture when we think about children. First, sometimes we make the mistake of thinking about children and adults as being radically different, that they're almost a separate species, that there's the humanity of children, the spirituality of children, that's one thing. And over on the other side, that of adults, which is a completely different thing. And what we prize in children is completely different than what we prize in adults. And how we talk to children is totally different than how we talk to adults. And especially in my work, that morality for children is a completely different thing than morality for adults. Second, we sometimes make the mistake in thinking, usually because of the first mistake, that children are not already subjects and knowers and actions and actors and spiritual and moral beings. So we tend to think of children, either their spirituality as something that's just for children and has really nothing to do, and it's lovely for them to have it. But that's not going to last when they enter the real world. It's something that only belongs in the nursery and in the special classroom, and it's not something connected to real life in any way. And third, there's a mistake that there's only one direction, that we have responsibilities towards children, but that they don't have any back to us, or they don't call on us, or they don't change us in all the ways that I described above. To acknowledge mutuality, of course, like I said, isn't to say that children and adults are identical. It's not the same thing as talking about, say, the mutuality between men and women. And it's really important that we pay attention to the particular needs and vulnerabilities of children, so that we don't demand from them more than it's fair, more that they can give. And what is true of children in general, I think, is also true of their spirituality. They are already connected to other subjects before they have a stable spiritual self. We have a tendency to think of spirituality in really autonomous ways. That which is mine, it arises out of me and my Robinness. It's just between me and God, or between me and my own self-transcendence. What's important to see is that a child's spirituality exists and is connected to that of others in the faith community and beyond the faith community before they're even conscious of it as spirituality, before they can even name it as their spirituality. That is, spirituality is first received from others. Theologically, of course, the spirituality is fundamentally received from God. Theologically, of course, even though we're gestated in the body of someone else, our beingness comes from God. But the spirituality, our spirituality, that of children, is also received and formed from others, not just when a child steps into a church or into a classroom, but it's received from others in whom they are in relationship. One of the fundamental expressions, of course, of this reality is in the church. It's in baptism, where a child is sealed in relationship to God from their infancy, and where spiritual promises are made on their behalf. So what's fascinating about baptism, right, is that it's a spiritual reality made real by the actions of God and by the vows of people who aren't ourselves, that changes who we are as spiritual beings. If we think of the stable self as coming first, this might seem a violation, like I'm saying that someone's spirituality isn't their spirituality. But if we understand our fundamental relationality, we can understand that that's okay, that our relationships have always preceded our selfhood and are constitutive of it. So there's some concern in saying that children have this pure spirituality. We often think of them in almost in ethereal, angelic ways. They have this pure thing, but they only lack the language to express it. But it's not that at all. For better or for worse, it's mediated through human relationships, shaped by culture, given by parents, and especially always, of course, in relationship to God. So what interests me too in children's spiritual encounters is, how do children's spiritual encounters change the language we use and that we teach to them to talk about God? But I'll come back to that a little bit later. So far then, I've said that children and adults, and I said it in a very long-winded way, share in a mutual and asymmetrical relationship. But I haven't said much yet that's specifically theological. In some ways, what I've said is just true of people. In some ways, I was going to say regardless of what you believe, but that's not really true, because what you believe really shapes what you pay attention to. But I want to say something specifically now, theologically, about children, and especially about what it means to become and to be children of God. And I want to start by cautioning against making an analogy between the asymmetry in the adult-child relationship to the relationship between us and God. There's some similarity, of course, right? When we just think about, oh, there's like kind of a big thing and a little thing, so it's kind of the same. But that's only by the barest analogy. And it's better expressed by the fact that our relationship with God is that of creature to creator, which is not the case when we're talking about adults and children. The human givenness of life experienced in natality is that we don't create ourselves. And that reminds us of our fundamental givenness by God, who creates and sustains. Our natality reflects that truth, but it's not the same type of truth, or the same truth, I should say. Because it's not the same, though we're not all children in relationship to each other. Actually, all of us, I think, on this call are grown up, at least on the outside. That in human life, we experience infancy and childhood and adulthood and old age. All of that's true for us as humans. But while our mutual and asymmetrical relationship with other humans constantly changes as we age, as our roles change, we remain children of God. For me, it's ultimately this childhood in God that creates the conditions for the asymmetrical and mutual relationship we experience in this life. So the first thing I want to say is, we've been talking a lot about asymmetry here, but it's not the same to say that a child is to its parents the way, say, the parent is to God, is a category mistake. Because the child and the parent share in a fundamental humanity that God comes to share in, of course, in the incarnation, but in an importantly different way. Karl Rahner, who you may or may not recognize, who's, has a great little 18-page essay. The man's a master of concision, where he talks about the start of our life as human beings as a twofold beginning. When we start life, we begin life as a child in two ways. First, as a human child, and second, as a child of God. Or he puts it this way. I'm paraphrasing because, of course, he still uses man most of the time. In the child, a human begins who must undergo the wonderful adventure of remaining a child forever, becoming a child to an ever increasing extent, making their childhood of God real and effective in this childhood that they have. For this is the task of their maturity. It is only in the child that the child, in the simple and absolute sense of the term, really begins. And that's the dignity of the child. The child's task and the child's claim upon us is that we can and must help him or her in this task. In serving the child in this way, therefore, there can be no question of petty sentimentality. Rather, it's the eternal value and dignity of humans who must become a child that we are concerned with. The human who only becomes a sharer in God's interior life, in that they become that child which they only begin to be in their own childhood. Which sounds a little bit like a riddle. But what he means is this: that time and eternity are bound up in each other. So that which is true in time, right? That we start out as infants and then we become toddlers, and if we're not too stupid in our adolescence, we become adults. That reality actually extends into eternity. But that which is eternally true, that we are children of God, is expressed through our lives in time. So childhood in both senses, human and eternal, only makes sense in relationship to each other. But the primary category for him is theological. Childhood can only be truly understood on the foundation of childhood and God. So childhood isn't just a phase of life. It's not just a part of biological development that we leave behind as our bones fuse and our head to body ratio changes to a little less like Calvin and Hobbes. Well, just Calvin. Hobbes is a tiger. But Rahner describes childhood as the basic condition of a life that is properly lived. And his point that childhood isn't left behind but continues with us is in line with theories of child development. We do not, as was once thought by Piaget and others, simply replace ideas with new ideas as we grow in biologically grounded capabilities. We don't just leave our whole childhood behind and replace it with adult ideas. Instead, we grow in relationship with others, and we grow in relationship to ourselves and our own past experiences. Our language and our defining characteristics and our paradigms of say God start out in fairly limited ways. Our paradigm for understanding God as father or mother might be grounded at first in our limited notion of our own mother or our own father. Then as we grow, we gradually mature that paradigm. We consider that other people have other mothers and fathers. There's all these other parental figures, both living and fictional and animal and so on. But that fundamental paradigm often persists, which is one of the reasons that the trauma can have such a lasting effect. Similarly, we don't replace our moral or spiritual language so much as we take what we've received and we gradually deepen its meaning. The initial paradigms and language that children receive to think about their spirituality, they don't disappear. They're actually foundational to the rest of our lives. And if we interrogate ourselves, we probably in some ways think and use language from our early childhood that persists in our much more mature categories. But it isn't just the case that childhood persists in certain ways in our life. Rahner's point is that childhood is the goal of the spiritual life for all people, regardless of age. The goal of Christian discipleship is to be children of God. This entails a recognition that children are already in relationship with God, and it also entails a recognition that there are certain goods of childhood, certain spiritual, emotional, and moral characteristics that properly model our relationship to God. But of course, we're not with Peter Pan or on the Isle of Children in Gulliver's Travels, so we don't remain children. We grow and we change and we become adults. So So what do we do? Well, Ronner talks about this as a second childhood, a childhood that is wise. We must work to retain those elements of childhood, not seeking independence and control and separation, but nurturing our capacities for relationality and dependence and humility. As children, we do this instinctively, but as adults, we do it reflectively and intentionally. So how can the assumption of full personal responsibility for what one does and decides to do be reconcilable with an abiding childlike attitude towards God? Well, Ronner says, by observing and recollecting childhood. So observing the childhood of others and recollecting our own childhood. There's a beautiful story by George MacDonald that illustrates this persistence, I think. In his fairy tale, The Golden Key, there's a little girl, Tangle, and a boy, Mossy, and they embark on a journey together to find the door, which can be opened by the golden key that Mossy finds. Mossy, though he's a child, accepts the responsibility of this quest when he comes upon the key by chance. The young-looking woman who initially takes him and Tangle in and sends them on their quest, gives them direction, though she looks young, is in fact thousands of years old. As Mossy and Tangle embark on their search for the door, they meet the old man of the sea, the old man of the earth, and the old man of the fire, who is the oldest of them all. In the fiery center of the earth, they find this oldest man who is a baby, playing with little balls that they somehow have the sense are keeping the entire universe going. And through the story, though it seems to Mossy and Tangle that only takes a few days, Tangle becomes an old woman, gray and wrinkled. But at the end of the story, after they're separated from each other in a place that looks like death, Mossy and Tangle reunite, and Mossy finds her looking young, much like the wise woman who took them in at the start. And the child and the childlike are intertwined in this story. And through reading it, we come to understand that it's the same in the world around us. Tangle and Mossy's bodies age as our spirits ought to, first as children, then as wrinkled adults, and then a reversion to youth, but a youth that is wise, a youth that knows where the door is, that knows what its priorities are. When Jesus sets the little child on his knee, he's not only calling on those around him to treat children with respect, he's raising up a child as a model of discipleship. This reality is evoked powerfully by his words, "Truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." There aren't many places where Christ talks about what we have to do to enter the kingdom of heaven. But this is one of them. One of the others is a caution against wealth. And I think in many ways, the independence and self-sufficiency that comes with that. And otherwise, he talks about belief, which is a relationship of dependence. It's belief that's required to enter the kingdom of heaven. The child that he puts on his knee is not an abstract construction, but it's an actual child. It's actual childhood being brought out in the mission of Jesus, who deepens the significance of childhood by putting it in the context of the mission of the kingdom of God. In this way, Jesus is continuing the story of God's people. His welcome continues and deepens and radicalized the Jewish acceptance of the inclusion of children by means of a prophetic act as a gesture in God's name of dramatic ingathering, says Francis in very fancy words. Throughout the Bible, children are integral to God's mission. It's always striking to me, given the imperfections and moral failings of almost every biblical character, to consider that almost all of the stories in the Bible about children are positive. Children are integral to God's covenant with Israel, both as promise and responsibility, and God cares about their welfare. I mentioned earlier Samuel, who restores God's purposes when Eli and his sons fail. There's a story too of Naaman, who has a little servant girl who's described in the Hebrew text in such juxtaposition to her big man master, this little girl. And yet it's her who tells her master about God, about his prophets, and how to seek healing for his leprosy. Her vulnerability changes what's important. It challenges the pretensions of the mighty and wealthy Naaman and offers hope instead for healing in life that's sought through humility and through her smallness. When Jesus picks up a child and sets him or her on his knee, it's not a particular special child. It's not just a really pretty one or a really capable one, but it's just any child who's there. The covenant of God, which is inclusive of children, meant not only that children ought to be cared for, but that their right to life isn't dependent just on their parents and their parents' decision. To the extent the existence of God's covenant as Father is the limiting power of human parents and the proper context, because every parent is also a child of God. So what does it mean to change and become like little children? Well, first, let me say emphatically what it's not. Becoming a child of God does not mean our cultural preoccupation with youth, with resistance to adulting, to the intense nostalgia. I mean, Star Wars is sold at Pottery Barn. The unwillingness to deal with the world's problems. Those desires are indicative of a desire to remain children, or in some ways more adolescents, with all of the freedoms and privileges and none of the responsibilities. But when Rahner talks about becoming little children, he invites us to consider the particular goods of childhood. Children's integrated body and soul, the way that fact and fantasy and story shape their lives, their openness to others, their trust. It's always striking to me that not only are children dependent, but they model dependency in a way where it's enjoyed and not feared. Right? We worry so much, especially in aging and having to be a burden of others, to having to be cared for. But children enjoy being cared for. For many children, nappy change time is a really special moment. Why? I mean, probably somewhat for hygiene reasons, but mostly because they get one-on-one attention with their parent. This little bit of the day where their parent or another adult takes a couple moments and attends solely to them. Children show us how dependency is something to be desired. Hans Urs von Balthasar names childlike amazement, elemental thanksgiving, and play as the identities of childhood. Karl Rahner talks about trust, openness, expectation, the readiness to be controlled by another, interior harmony with the fact that they don't have control over things. Though anyone with a toddler knows that interior harmony comes and goes. All these gifts of childhood, attending to them, help us become children of God. So by uniting Rahner and Francis and Bahler, we can say that the right asymmetrical relationship between adults and children is truly mutual because both are children of God. Rahner's second childhood, the childhood that is wise, is truly mutual because it relies on childhood observed and recollected. The focus of the child texts in the New Testament are all on divine inclusion, on the continuation of God's care as demonstrated in the Old Testament. Interestingly, Francis, who writes a lot about children in the Bible, he says it's not even specifically or it's not primarily about the qualifications of children, though it can be helpful to identify those. But actually, the gifts of childhood only make sense in consideration of the giver. We learn concretely from children, specifically because like them, we are children of God. But this relationship is asymmetrical in two ways. Powerfully, in the ways in which children receive and learn from adults, that they're formed, and especially in terms of the moral responsibilities that we have towards them. Then it's asymmetrical, the big part of Mr. Potato Head, in the direction of adults. But in some ways, when we talk about the model of discipleship, that relationship changes. It's the child who teaches. The responsibility, of course, is primarily on the side of the adult, who must humble themselves to learn from children. But there's an asymmetry of teaching on the side of the child too, who helps adults recover the goods of childhood. And it allows us to see something of the distortion that can arise if adults forget this fundamental calling to be children of God. In that case, the asymmetry of the relationship is only one way, that adults represent the fullness of humanity, and they simply draw the child or drag the child along towards that goal. There's no true mutuality here. The ways in which the child shapes the adults are secondary and only find meaning if they conform the adult more to the goals of adulthood. But what does it mean in a practical sense to change and become like little children? And what on earth, after all this time I've been talking, does it have to do with the actual children we see on Sunday mornings? I'm going to say just a little bit about this, but I hope to hear from you in our discussion time, because I want to hear how you unite some of the ideas from your experiences with children. You are those who engage so much of your time with children and with their spiritual lives. In this way, I don't have anything to teach you about that, but I want to hear from you. But I'm going to say a few practical examples, I think, of some of the ways this can play out. One of the ways in which we learn what it means to be a child of God is through observing and remembering the way children learn with their bodies and communicate with their bodies through movement and touch. It can remind us all of our need for the same. Children so obviously and perhaps uncontrollably think and feel through their bodies. They experience life in an integrated manner where thoughts and imagination and movement and vocalizations and touch are not extras, but integral to who they are. When we invite children to cross the threshold, to think about spaces in different ways, to sit or stand, we ask them to continue to consider how their bodily posture prepares them to hear a story, or to play with a story, or to receive food, or whatever it happens to be that they're doing. According to Jamie Smith in his book, Desiring the Kingdom, this isn't something true of children only. In fact, he doesn't really discuss children at all in his book. He argues for the integral connection between liturgy and learning and formation. It's so deeply a part of us, he argues, that human beings are fundamentally not thinking animals for him, not rational animals, but liturgical animals, embodied, practicing creatures whose love and desire is aimed at something ultimate. Because of this, education, including religious education, is a holistic endeavor that involves the whole person, including their bodies, in a process of formation that aims our desires, primes our imagination, and orients us to the world. Thus, the process of learning is shaped by a community, it's immersed in story, and it involves the whole person. For those of you who set up and work in a Godly Play classroom, this is probably such an obvious truth, it's almost banal of me to mention it. But it's something that's forgotten often when we think of the spiritual lives of adults. But attending to children with humility, we can learn something about what it means to be the children of God by looking at what they need in their spirituality. Children make our communal needs obvious. We see the way they're shaped by communities. They make bodily posture obvious. All of those things. Central to Smith's account is that which we love or that which we desire. This loving is central to what Rahner calls the openness of childhood. In a very rational, adult, head-first approach, we might be tempted to consider the openness of childhood as like a blank slate, as people often say, or a wax tablet. That the openness is more akin to emptiness, where children are ready to be filled with whatever we teach them. Instead, though this openness, when we pay attention to children, is the manifestation of a loving and desiring that characterizes human life. So children's openness, especially through their bodies, reminds adults of what spiritual openness looks like and the types of conditions we need for it to happen properly. Children also, by virtue of intentional programs of religious education, often have a significant store of knowledge that's lacked by adults. Should we not find it strange that it's the children in our churches who have a much better grasp of what the temple looks like? As a child, I could draw the temple with accuracy. I knew which priests wore which outfits. In fact, and I must admit that today I couldn't do that. I mean, I have a rudimentary grasp of the temple's shape. And my immersion in Richard of St. Victor, who wrote on the Ark of the Covenant, gives me a pretty decent mental image of what it looks like, but I've actually lost the intimate knowledge gained in Sunday school that most children will have. Through the intentional, repetitive, visual, and tactile immersion in the stories of the Bible. It's actually the children in our churches, more often than the adults, who can relay with accuracy biblical stories, locations, and structures. The stories are central to who we are as human beings. Then adult unfamiliarity with the biblical story should cause us concern. What does it mean to be the children of God if we don't know the stories of God's actions with his children? I'm so sorry, everyone. By attending to the way stories shape children's spiritual lives, we are made aware of the ways in which our own lives are shaped by stories. And there's so much more I could say about how children make obvious the givenness of our human natures, the natality that's true of all of us that I talked about at the beginning. I could say a lot about children's ability to wonder and to worship, and the way they play with nonsense and silence and all of those things. But I'm at the end of my time. And none of this to say, of course, that children are innocents who have a perfect grasp of God and need no formation or no correction or any of that. But instead, what I'm saying is that by attending to children's spirituality, by looking at the ways that they encounter God in God's stories, we can learn something about our own spiritual development. This attending to children, crucial to all of us becoming the children of God, is not only good for us too, it's good for children. It involves them as co-creators of meaning. It includes them truly as brothers and sisters in Christ. So in the asymmetrical and mutual relationship between adults and children, we can see the responsibilities of adults towards children to teach them the language through which their spirituality is expressed and shaped, to pass on the stories of faith in ways that are accessible, to honor their insights, to see their relationship with God as a true relationship, however inexpertly expressed. But it would be a mistake to see this formation as simply a one-way street, a responsibility that adults have towards children, where adults know all, where adults have the correct language, where they have exhaustive meaning. Instead, formation is a shared process. Children's presence and language use challenges and shapes the language that we use. Children's bodily movements invite a reconsideration of our own embodiment. Children's embrace and enjoyment of dependency opens to us the folly and hubris, even idolatry, in our quest for independence. Children as children teach us about our own childhood in God. So a question I want to leave with you as I finish is, what is happening between the threshold of the godly playroom and the spiritual life of a whole parish or church community? There's a constant adult temptation, I think, to limit the knowledge and insights of children, to see it as aimless wondering, or at best an individual spiritual awareness, and not an insight into God's reality or into the reality of being human that makes a claim on us. If we are to learn to be children of God, I think this threshold must be thin. If it doesn't arise out of a strong grounding in the mutual, if asymmetrical relationship between children and adults, then how can we learn to be children of God? How can we humble ourselves to look at the children in our churches and to learn from them?
Thank you, Robin. I think that I appreciate Michelle also leaving some quotes there in the chat box that leaves us with a lot to ponder and wonder. I wonder if there are any questions that you might have for Robin, or if you'd like to answer what she asked. How are you making that threshold thin between your circle and the greater context?
It's our first dog of godly play.
Rufus.
Something to say. See, someone saying that's a tricky one.
I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much for what you gave us. There was such a lot in what you said, and some of it quite vexing, that we do see these things in children, and somehow it gets squashed out of them at some stage through influences in media or society or homes. And it's so hard to, well, what we're up against to do that sort of what I would call soft evangelism. We run a children's choir, community choir, but with the church's support as a means of reaching children through music and singing sacred music. And I am constantly in awe of children and the gifts they bring to us to enrich our lives. And the responsibility we have is not to squash it out of them or limit it in any way. It's an awesome responsibility, and you're constantly thinking about that too. So thank you so much for that. But the church does not take on board what you are saying. My church does not take on board the place of children. I find it heartbreaking. You can go to meetings, diocesan meetings, you can go to all kinds of council things, and they never mention children. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Yeah, I think often our churches have been more influenced than they know by cultural ideas about children. And I think there's a lingering sense, really from the Victorian period, that children belong in these child-only spaces. They belong in the nursery and they belong in the classroom. And those are good and important places for children. But they have nothing to do with the real life of faith of the church. And at best, they're places where you turn them from kind of, snotty-nosed little kids in nappies into formed adults. But it only goes one way. And unfortunately, with that often comes quite actually a disrespect for what's even happening in those child-specific places. Oh, that godly play, that's great for children. Oh, isn't it nice that the little ones have something? But there's no way that I could learn something from a godly play classroom. That the wondering that the children do there might bring up deep spiritual questions that will shape my own spiritual life, right? Or that the language that they use should shape the language we use in the church, and so on and so forth. That what they're doing there, they're just trying on faith. They're just trying on real ideas. They're trying on spirituality as a dress rehearsal for the true thing that's going to come later. But it's just not a big, strong, it's not Naaman, a big, strong warrior man that Christ puts on his knee and says, this is what you have to be in the kingdom of heaven. But that's usually who gets primacy in our church.
Julie says, I find it depends on if people want to look behind the threshold.
Can you say a bit more by that? Do you mean that that some of the people in your church have a real interest in what happens in the circle and others don't, and it's just, so the reaction really depends on whether they do it?
Yeah, sorry, I'm similar to you this evening, so I've had my camera off as I've been blowing my nose and everything. Yeah, I find there are some people who have a very genuine interest in what is happening and they want to be supportive. They maybe don't know how, but they're keen, and they want to be involved. And then there's other people, as you say, who are just quite standoffish and, that's for them and don't really have much interest. And much as you want to keep that threshold thin, as you were saying, you want to find ways of creating those intergenerational bonds and relationships and discipleship that would move in both directions. Some people just aren't interested, and they do still hold that opinion of these children should be seen and not heard in church. They should sit there and be quiet. They shouldn't use their whole bodies for worship or praise or communication, and they don't understand, and rightly or wrongly, it's not something that has been in their mindset or in their growing up that was never acceptable to them, and they don't deem it acceptable now, and they don't really want that threshold to thin any further than they're already being pushed and forced to.
Yeah, and I think that's in many ways a failure to understand what adult spirituality should be, right? If you think that children should be seen and not heard, or not even seen, I mean, I know churches that basically you come in, you drop your kids off at Sunday school, you go to the real church, and then you pick them up after. They don't even appear in the sanctuary. A lot of that has to do with the fact that our model of discipleship is a very adult-driven one. What I appreciate about someone like Karl Rahner is he starts by asking, who are we in relation to God? And then what's the goal of our life of discipleship? What's the goal of our spiritual life? He says it's to be a child. And in some ways, you have to understand that first. As, in some ways, adults have to see themselves as children of God before you get the valuing of children in church spaces. So in some ways, it's not the responsibility of a godly play classroom to thin the threshold, though I think it can be a powerful witness. But I think it's the necessity of adults asking themselves what a disciple of Christ looks like.
Just reading a few. Sean was saying that the threshold remains quite fixed in many places, but where it softens, I've seen some adults become vulnerable and open to the child within them. We have a lot to learn about mutuality. And it can be a huge blessing and encouragement, often giving permission to others to join in.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point. And I think, you know, what I said about dependency too, right? You know, our fear of relying on others. Children show us how it can be fun. They remind us, and I think that's true of, or enjoyable, or life-giving, or blessedly, they don't even think about it at all. I do a lot of work on end-of-life decision making in children. And one of the things that comes up a lot is adult fears, parental fears about the children losing their independence, or things like that. Because that's, you know, one of our primary fears about death and dying. And some of the, you know, the child workers in the hospitals and the ethicists will say, hold on, but your child's just not worried about that. They don't see it as a problem. That's not a concern that they have. They're quite happy to be defended. They might have other concerns, but actually it's a relief for them to depend on you in this way. And so sometimes allowing children to model this for us can be a relief to us as well. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who you might know, is quite famous for her 5 stages of grief. That work, the work she started, is based on her experiences with dying children. And then she thought, they know so much, they can teach us how to do this well. And I think in our churches, it can often be the same. And it, like you said in your comment, so I didn't catch the name, but you know who commented that. You know, in your comment that you said, it can be actually liberating, life-giving, vibrant for adults to have these encounters with children. It's not just like, oh, it's good for kids or something, or we're making them feel more included. No, it's good for us.
See, Alex commented, sometimes when they, meaning children, are in the sanctuary, they are there for a nativity or to sing or to play music and to entertain the adult congregation.
Yeah, that's really true. And I think a lot of that is comes out of our inability to see that children are capable of worship. Because that's what the sanctuary is for, right? The sanctuary is the place where we worship God. And so kids come in first, they have to come in from somewhere. All the adults are already there. They come in, for these entertainment things. Maybe even to help the adults worship a little bit. But we don't think of them as equal participants in the sanctuary in the sense that they also worship. One of the things that that Brock Baller talks about, and there's a Russian child psychologist named Vygotsky. It's all Y's in his name. He talks about the difference between what we can do on our own and what we can do shared. So he talks about, he has a fancy name, the zone of proximal development, which is the difference between what a child can do by themselves or on their own power and what the child can do through the guidance and help of more advanced peers and of adults and that sort of thing. And how it kind of relates to what we're talking about right now is that a child can understand what it means to worship God through the shared experience of worship with adults, with other peers, long before they might get to some understanding of worship on their own. And so, you know, even Brock Bowler will talk about an infant can intend what their parents intend. So an infant in the sanctuary, first, of course, is already in relationship with God, which is all it takes for worship. But second, they can worship through and with their parents, through imitating the facial gestures, through their physical receptivity to what their parents are doing in the act of worship. If you're holding a baby and you kneel, that baby's going down with you, you know? And so, we often invite children to the sanctuary to kind of do things because we're not confident that they could just be there worshiping God. And also that then the ways that they worship God, like someone mentioned a little bit earlier, can be disruptive, right? They don't sit still. Heaven forbid while they do it, right?
Yes, I have one who doesn't like to sit still. Listens very well while he's moving though. I've seen a comment that I missed earlier from Alex as well, saying, I find that I learn so much from the children in my circle when they wonder. And I agree with Maureen that we have a huge and awesome responsibility in the work we do with children. A huge responsibility.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. One of the tricky things there can be, how do we balance learning so much from children's wondering and allowing them to wonder in really free ways with our responsibilities to help them form the right ideas. And I don't want to sound too prescriptive about this, but children learn languages outside of our circle as well. They're taught things about the faith and about the world outside as well, that sometimes we want to correct, or that it's important to correct. And one of the challenges can really be, how do we do both well? How do we learn so much from children and their wondering, but also help them wonder in better ways? And that's it's one of the real challenges of this mutual and asymmetrical relationship, that we're tasked with both of those things. It can be really hard, but also so incredibly vibrant. Children wonder the most, as you all know, the most incredible things. And one of the great things they do as brothers and sisters of Christ, as other disciples of God, is open us to dimensions of our spirituality, to parts of the biblical story that we think we know. And we're like, oh yeah, I know the story of the temple. I learned that like 25 years ago, like done. You know, and you have a kid and they're like, so why can a goat get a lot of sins? Right. I forgot about the goat. You know, they say, I wonder how a goat could get some sins. Well, was it a bad goat? You know, there's something incredible about children's ability to make old things new. Which I always think is so much of what their wondering is doing. It's taking something that was boring and mundane to us, or a little dusty, or maybe a little obscure, and it's bringing it out and polishing it and saying, look at this gem. You're like, oh goodness, I forgot about that. Or actually, I don't know that, or I wonder that too. In language, they sometimes talk about, in linguistic theories, metaphorical rupture, where a word or a concept suddenly has a completely new meaning. And I always think that children's wondering does that so much. So does their their play with words and their use of nonsense language, right? It suddenly takes this old, boring thing and it transforms it. And when we think about the ways in life our fate, like our spiritual lives so easily become stale, mundane, that vibrancy is such a spiritual gift for us to receive.
Hillary has shared, the best thing about having child or being with children is getting to see things as a child again, from joyfully silly to profound.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you find that when you do that, you learn something new about yourself? It can be anyone who answers that. I don't want to put you guys too much on the spot, but it's something to take home and think about. Does it change how you think about yourself in your own relationship with God and your own relationship with the biblical stories? Or with snack? Snacking becomes so much more a part of your life when you have children. My goodness.
Larry says, definitely things I had forgotten that were so precious, or things I never saw before. Seeing things in ways. Alex says, yes, I learned that I can be silly and it is fun. Maybe not so much the profound.
But silliness, well, first, I'm not going to knock fun for fun's sake, but also that reminds us something about ourselves and our needs too. Adulthood isn't just seriousness. And then our churches are for serious things, for serious people. But silliness is also part of God's creation.
Michelle says, the children have changed my relationship with time. There is a time to stop and touch the grass and smell the flowers.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point. And I think sometimes Karl Rahner's fascinating little essay that he has, it's a very short essay, and I think a third of it is just talking about time, what time is. For him, it's so clearly integrally related. I summarized it very briefly in my talk. But actually remembering that our concept of time is not necessarily God's concept of time either. And being able to see time anew allows us to play with those categories and to consider, oh, right, what if time is different when I'm with children than when I'm alone? Is time different too when I'm with God? Is time different for God?
Hillary says, seriousness is not one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit.
Preach, Hillary.
Sean says, being present. Children are so good at being in the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. There's just I sometimes think of the way in church I go and take communion. And about a third of me is there. And about a third of me is thinking about the things I need to do after church. And about a third of me is who knows what, it's not there, but I'm not really sure where else it is. And to go back to worship, that I always think like, what worship am I giving when a third of my brain is here? All of my body, luckily, but that incredible presentness of children. Sometimes just straight up is like a little bit of a slap in the face, a moral reminder that, oh, right, I'm in the presence of God. In the very least, it should look like that, where I'm all there. Luckily, God is gracious. But children, the way that children are so present can actually place a moral demand on us, remind us, actually, no, that's what being in a holy place means. That's what being in the presence of God means. That's what worship means. And again, for myself, I always think, oh man, I've denigrated or wondered about doubted a child's ability to worship. And here I'm the one sitting in the sanctuary, only half paying attention. I think if we humble ourselves, there's just so much. So many ways in which we can enrich our spiritual lives. There are so many ways in which we can be better disciples.
Peter has commented, thank you for flagging up the need to see Christmas starting at the Feast of the Annunciation. Is there a significance in the fact that the incarnation depends on a child, whereas the creation stories of the Hebrew scriptures begin with adults?
Yeah, there is a significance. So what's really fascinating, I mean, the creation story uses the word man and woman, not boy and girl, or the many, actually there's many Hebrew words to describe children and youths of all sorts of ages. There's a woman named Julie Parker who collected them all, for us. And I think there's 31 or so different terms. So, part of me wants to say, well, we don't really know how old Adam and Eve were, or how much growing up, but and some child theologians like to go that route. I'm with you who asked the question, that I think the Hebrew scriptures do really describe them as a man and a woman. There is kind of a grown-upness about them. Is it significant that the Christian story starts with Jesus as a baby? Yes, absolutely. James Francis talks about how Jesus' welcome of children, it extends the Jewish views on children and welcome of children, but also radicalizes it in a totally new way. And I think that's one of the places where it radicalizes it, where Jesus, who is God, starts off as a fetus, and then, and I think that's really central to the Christian story, in a way that children are so central to the covenant in Israel. And in some ways, we could say that's children are so central to the covenant in Israel, and actually overcoming barrenness, right? The fact that God gives children and we don't just make them of our own power is so central to the formative stories of Israel. So in some ways, you know, yes, it really does matter that Jesus began as a baby. Also, though, the covenant, like the gifting of children, is so integral to the formation of the covenant that that's also an important starting place, as well as the garden in Genesis. And that is a place where, and especially because there are different types of texts, right? Genesis is a mythical style telling, whereas once you get to the covenants, it's narrative, which is what the Gospels are narratives as well. This is where Jessica needs to like drag TJ in to give you a much more sophisticated lesson. So for me, I often draw then, I think there's more parallels between the beginning of the covenant and the beginning of Jesus's life than there are to the Genesis story. And that givenness, that children are given through the power of God and not just through our own creative biological forces, is there from the beginning of the story of Israel in ways that I think are really important. But there is something so radical about Christ becoming a child. And like I said, not just a baby, but first in the womb of someone else. So when Christ became human, he became completely dependent for continued existence as a human being on Mary, right? It's her placenta. Well, I guess it depends whether who you think the placenta belongs to. But it's her blood, it's her nourishment that was responsible for continuing the earthly life of Jesus. And I think that's so significant when we think about our relationality and our dependence and our lack of control, and our openness. Like a lot of the things that Rahner talks about as kind of goods of childhood are illustrated really powerfully in how Jesus became human.
We have just a few more minutes. I don't know if there are any more lingering questions or wonderings or comments that anyone would like to put out there before we close this session.
Yes, please. Hello. I'm trying to get my video to work again and it's not playing. I just wondered if anybody had practiced godly play during lockdown over the internet out of interest. Could you hear?
You're breaking up a bit.
Did anyone use the internet for godly play during lockdown?
So there was something about using the internet and godly play during
I don't know
lockdown.
if you can hear me.
Are you able to type your question into the chat box? It might be a bit easier to get it.
Asking if anyone has used the Godly Play online.
I'll try.
I think she's already. I used it last year with about 6 classes or 6 sessions with 3 or 4 different classes in a primary school, and it was better than nothing, but it wasn't ideal. So yeah, and it was a bit scary. Michelle helped me get it all set up. It was a bit scary just trying to figure it all out, but I did some practice sessions on the Google Meets, I think it was, that the school was using, so that I could position the story in the right place, and also me, and have things hidden, and also help me to see what the room looked like and hide things that were distracting. And so there was quite a lot of preparation involved. And it was interesting, the dynamics of not being in the classroom. I like to be in control, so that was always really hard, just to have to give control to the teacher and not be able to just use hands or eye contact, lots of different other ways that you would use to help get a connection with the children that might settle them down. But it was nice, and we worked different ways of getting answers to questions. But yeah, I would try it if that's the only way you can make the connection with the school, but it's not like a true godly play session in my experience, but I don't know about other people.
And we ended up, our circle was meeting online for Godly Play for about 8 months during lockdown. And what was interesting about the experience is that the parents joined us. And so our circle became very intergenerational as a result of lockdown. And that's where earlier, when Sean was mentioning seeing the transformation in parents or in adults and seeing them relate to their childhood, you could see that in that circle a lot. And when we came back to being in person after lockdown, we thought we'll try it for a bit longer as an intergenerational circle. And so we came back with the parents taking part with the children as well, just because it was really something special actually during lockdown to experience that. And we weren't ready to let that go yet. So that's a little bit of something that I'm talking about with Katie tomorrow in our workshop, actually, is how lockdown has changed how our circle and our church is thinking about Godly Play. So.
Yeah, in some ways it sounds like when you had to get rid of your physical threshold, the threshold became thin between at least some of the rest of your parish and Godly Play, because it's happening in the houses. I love that you guys trusted children's abilities to meet online, because I think a lot of times people say, well, children are tactile, children need to move, like they can't do that in a digital format. And I have to say, I really love that that you trusted the children involved, that they were capable of this instead of just dismissing it. I think that's really lovely.
I think what was also neat is it was the children who helped their parents help the adults figure out how to do it and to approach it. So again, where the mutuality was there, that the children were leading us and being the door people in their own homes to build that threshold for the parents to feel welcome to come into the circle. And so that's probably one of the highlights of that time, actually.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think again illustrates what children can do when things are shared. So they've had someone who's welcomed them, who's kind of explained what that welcome means. And by doing it, but through their own experience, they understand what it is, and now they can do it for someone else. And I think that's keeping those sorts of things in mind, that ability of children. And it's often not until we really attend to children or we ask something of children that we get, and instead of infantilizing them, that we get a chance to see all the ways in which that they can do things. And I think it's very much the same in so many aspects of children's spiritual lives and discipleship, that it's not until we let them do it that we realize how capable they are.
I think that we need to move on to our closing worship this evening, but Thank you so much, Robin. This has been such a delight. I think we'll all be thinking of becoming and being with and becoming children of God, and that phrase in a new way coming out of here. Sean says, thanks, Robin. It's been a really interesting evening and a great start to the conference. And I agree, a great way to start. We have lots in store tomorrow, but I'm going to turn it over to Catherine, and she's going to lead us in our closing worship.